At its wartime peak, the Packard plant employed 36,000 workers across more than 3 million square feet of Detroit, a complex so vast it had its own railroad, its own fire department, its own power station. They built the finest luxury cars in America, rivals to Rolls-Royce, sold with a six-word promise: ask the man who owns one. Then the market shifted, and the decisions began. A merger with Studebaker that was supposed to create a fourth force in the auto industry. A rescue deal that handed control to an aerospace company. A consolidation that moved production to South Bend and left the Detroit plant with nothing to do. By 1956, the machine stopped. The workers went home. The building stood empty for 60 years. Most of it is rubble now, demolished after a court declared it a public nuisance. A single con building remains, preserved for a redevelopment that promises to bring jobs back to land that hasn't known work since Eisenhower. This is the story of how James Ward Packard built something worth moving 200 miles for, how Detroit investors turned it into an empire, and how a long series of reasonable choices reduced a century of craft to silence. Not through disaster, through decisions, one at a time. The story begins in Ohio, not Detroit. In Warren, a small city in the Mahoning Valley where the Packard brothers, James Ward and William Dowd, ran an electrical supply company in the 1890s. They made incandescent lamps, transformers, cable, solid work, profitable work, the kind of work that built a life but not a legend. James Ward Packard was an engineer by training and temperament, methodical, precise, the kind of man who took things apart to understand them, then put them back together better than he found them. In 1898, he bought an automobile, a Winton, built in Cleveland, and drove it home to Warren. The car broke down, more than once. Packard complained to Alexander Winton himself, and Winton reportedly told him that if he thought he could do better, he should build his own. So he did. The first Packard automobile rolled out of a Warren workshop in 1899. It had a single-cylinder engine, a top speed of maybe 20 miles an hour, and a hand-built quality that reflected everything James Ward Packard believed about making things. The car worked. It didn't break down. And when it did, Packard knew exactly why, because he'd built every piece of it himself. William handled the business side. James handled the engineering. Together, they produced a handful of cars each year, expensive, impeccably made, sold to buyers who valued quality over flash. The company was small, the ambitions were not, but Warren, Ohio was not where the automobile industry was being born. That was happening 200 miles northwest, in a city built on lumber money and Great Lakes shipping, where investors with deep pockets were betting everything on the horseless carriage. Detroit. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. In 1901, a man named Henry Bourne Joy saw a Packard automobile at the New York Auto Show. Joy came from one of Detroit's wealthiest families. His father had been a railroad magnate. His social circle included Newberrys and Algers, old money with new appetites for industrial opportunity. Joy bought the Packard he saw at the show. He drove it. He liked it enough to take a train to Warren and meet the brothers who built it. What Joy saw wasn't just a well-made automobile. He saw a company that could be something larger, if only it had capital and connections. He went back to Detroit and gathered investors. Truman Handy Newberry, Russell Alger Jr., James McMillan, Dexter Ferry Jr., Philip Boyer, Joseph Ducharme. Names that meant something in Michigan, money that could build an empire. By 1902, the company had reorganized as the Packard Motor Car Company, and Henry Bourne Joy was general manager. A year later, the Packards agreed to move production to Detroit, where the investors lived, where the suppliers were clustering, where the future of the American automobile was being written. James Ward Packard came up with the slogan himself, 6 words that would define the brand for half a century. Ask the man who owns one. It wasn't advertising hyperbole. It was a promise. Build something so good that your customers become your salesmen. Let the quality speak for itself. In September 1903, the Packard Motor Car Company opened its new Detroit plant on East Grand Boulevard. 10 buildings designed by a young architect named Albert Kahn, the largest, most modern automobile factory in the world. The brothers from Warren had built something worth moving 200 miles for. Now they had to prove they could compete with the giants being born all around them. Albert Kahn was 34 years old when Packard hired him. The son of a German rabbi, he'd grown up in poverty in Detroit after his family immigrated when he was 11. No formal architectural training. He'd learned the trade as an office boy and draftsman, then won a scholarship to study in Europe. By the time he met the Packard investors, he was building a reputation for industrial work. Factories, warehouses, the unglamorous buildings that made the economy run. The Packard Commission would change American manufacturing. Factories in 1903 were dark, dangerous places. Wooden beams and heavy timber held up multiple floors. Windows were small because load-bearing walls needed to be thick. Light came from gas lamps that could ignite the sawdust and oil that accumulated everywhere. Fires were constant. Collapses were common. Working in a factory meant working in the gloom. Kahn and his brother Julius, an engineer, had been experimenting with reinforced concrete, steel rods embedded in poured concrete to create structures that could bear enormous weight without wooden beams or thick walls. The principle wasn't new. The application was. What Kahn built for Packard was something no American factory worker had ever seen. Building number 10, completed in 1905, had reinforced concrete columns spaced far apart, thin walls, and enormous windows. The floor didn't shake when the machinery ran. The walls didn't need to hold up the roof. And daylight poured in from three sides, filling the workspace with something that had never been a design priority before: visibility. Workers could see what they were doing. Supervisors could see the entire floor. The darkness that had defined factory work for a century lifted, and in its place was something that felt almost modern: an industrial space built for human beings, not just machines. The Kahn system, as it came to be called, would transform American industry. Within 2 decades, Albert Kahn would design factories for Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, and dozens of other manufacturers. The reinforced concrete daylight factory, born at Packard, became the standard for industrial architecture worldwide. But in 1905, it was just one plant on East Grand Boulevard, and the Packards still had cars to build. Henry Bourne Joy had become president by then. James Ward Packard remained involved through 1909, but his health was failing, and the company was becoming something larger than 2 brothers in a workshop could manage. Joy brought in Jesse Vinson as chief engineer, a self-taught genius who would design some of the most advanced engines of his era. Alvin McCauley, a lawyer turned executive, joined the leadership team and would eventually succeed Joy as president. The early Packards established the brand's identity through engineering excellence and one very specific claim: reliability. In 1903, a Packard became the first automobile to cross the United States under its own power. A 61-day journey from San Francisco to New York that proved these machines could do more than circle city blocks. Model after model pushed the boundaries of what automobiles could be. Bigger engines, smoother rides, more powerful performance. By 1910, the plant had expanded from 10 buildings to nearly 20. Employment climbed past 2,000. Production increased every year. And the Packard name meant something specific in the marketplace. These were the finest automobiles made in America, handcrafted by skilled workers in a factory that was itself a marvel of modern design. The vehicles themselves commanded prices that put them beyond ordinary buyers. A Packard cost more than most Americans earned in a year. These were cars for industrialists, bankers, the new millionaires of the automobile age itself. When you drove a Packard, you were announcing something about who you were and what you'd achieved. The company didn't apologize for this. They leaned into it. The marketing promised not just transportation, but status. Not just engineering, but art. And unlike many of their competitors, they delivered on the promise. Independent testing consistently ranked Packard among the finest automobiles in the world, mentioned alongside Rolls-Royce and the great European marques. By 1915, the East Grand Boulevard plant had grown to more than 30 buildings spread across a site that stretched for blocks. The architecture that Kahn pioneered had been refined and expanded, each new building featuring the same open floors, the same wash of natural light, the same reinforced concrete solidity that made the whole complex feel permanent. Built to last. The plant employed thousands now. Skilled machinists, metalworkers, assemblers, painters, inspectors, craftsmen, who took pride in what they made because what they made was worth taking pride in. A job at Packard wasn't just a paycheck. It was a statement about the kind of work you did and the kind of person you were. And the plant itself was becoming a landmark. Visitors came from around the world to see the factory that had changed how factories were built. Architecture journals published features on the Kahn system. Engineering schools sent students to study how concrete and steel could create these vast, light-filled spaces. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was that the building would outlast the work by more than half a century. The golden age of Packard began in the 1920s and reached its peak in the years just before and during the Second World War. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what those years felt like inside the plant, the rhythm of the work, the culture of the place, the particular pride that came from building what everyone agreed were the finest automobiles in America. The East Grand Boulevard complex had grown to nearly 40 buildings by then, sprawling across more than 3 million square feet. The original Kahn structures anchored the site, but expansion had pushed the plant in every direction. Walking from one end to the other took 20 minutes. The company ran its own railroad spur, its own power plant, its own fire department, a city within the city, organized entirely around the making of automobiles. A worker arriving for the morning shift in, say, 1936, would have parked in a lot that held thousands of cars, many of them Packards, bought with employee discounts and payments spread across months of paychecks. The walk to the time clock took you past the administration building, a handsome structure that announced the company's ambitions, then through the gates and into the industrial complex proper. The first thing you'd notice was the sound. Not one sound, but layers of them. The rhythmic punch of stamping presses, the whine of machining tools, the rumble of the conveyors that moved parts from station to station. Underneath it all, a low vibration in the concrete floor that you felt more than heard, the pulse of the plant at work. The second thing was the light. Even in the oldest buildings, the Kahn windows flooded the workspaces with daylight. Workers could see the grain of the wood they shaped, the sheen of the metal they polished, the exact color of the paint they applied. This wasn't incidental. The quality Packard promised depended on workers being able to see precisely what they were doing. The third thing, and this took longer to notice but it was everywhere, was the smell. Machine oil, sharp and mineral, hot metal from the machining department, the chemical tang of the paint shop, leather being cut and stitched in the upholstery department, and underneath it all, the particular scent of a factory running clean. No smoke, no burning, just the honest smell of materials being transformed into something valuable. Benno Miller worked as a toolmaker at Packard for more than 30 years. When the company and the UAW's local 190 negotiated one of the auto industry's first pension plans, Miller became the first retiree to receive a monthly check. There's a photograph somewhere, Miller accepting the check, Union President Ralph Urban standing beside him, company officials in suits looking on. A toolmaker's hands, spotted with decades of machine oil, holding a piece of paper that represented a promise. Work here, give us your skill, and we'll take care of you when the work is done. That promise mattered. Packard workers weren't laborers in the anonymous industrial sense. They were craftsmen. The plant was organized to reward skill, and the skill required was extraordinary. A Packard engine block had to meet tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. A body panel had to curve exactly right, with no waves or ripples visible when the light hit it. The paint, layer after layer of lacquer, hand-rubbed between coats, had to gleam like a mirror. The company maintained a proving ground in Shelby Township, north of the city, where every component was tested to destruction. Engines ran on dynamometers for hundreds of hours. Suspensions were pounded over cobblestone and gravel. The advertising promised quality, and the proving ground made sure the advertising wasn't lying. Workers knew this. The testing wasn't secret, it was a source of pride. When you built a part that went into a Packard, you knew it would be examined, tested, and measured before it ever reached a customer. The scrutiny felt like respect. The company cared enough to check. By the late 1930s, Packard employed more than 10,000 workers. The plant ran multiple shifts, morning, afternoon, night, and the neighborhood around East Grand Boulevard organized itself around the factory schedule. Diners opened early for the night shift going home. Bars filled up after the afternoon shift let out. Churches scheduled services to accommodate families whose breadwinners worked Sundays. The community around the plant was dense and diverse. Polish and Italian and Irish families who'd come to Detroit for the auto industry lived in neat rows of houses within walking distance of the gates. Black families from the South, part of the Great Migration, settled in adjacent neighborhoods, though the plant itself, like much of American industry, sorted workers by race in ways that limited opportunity. In the skilled trades, the workforce was overwhelmingly white. Black workers at Packard were concentrated in the foundry and sanitation departments, hot, dangerous, low-paying work that white workers avoided. The union, Local 190, had power within the plant, but that power was unevenly distributed. Some departments were integrated, others weren't. The promise that Packard represented, skilled work, good wages, a path to the middle class, was a promise not everyone could collect on equally. This mattered. It would matter more when the decline came, because the workers who'd been excluded from the best jobs would be the first to lose the jobs they had. The Second World War transformed the Packard plant. The company had already built aircraft engines. The Liberty engine of the First World War, designed in part by Packard's Jesse Vincent, had powered Allied planes over France. Now, with America entering another global conflict, the federal government came to East Grand Boulevard with a request. Rolls-Royce had developed the Merlin engine, a 12-cylinder power plant that would become the heart of the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the P-51 Mustang, and the Lancaster bomber. Britain needed Merlins faster than British factories could make them. The War Production Board needed an American company with the precision engineering capability to build one of the most sophisticated engines in the world. In 1940, Packard agreed to take on the contract. The challenge was enormous. The Merlin had more than 14,000 parts, with tolerances tighter than anything the auto industry typically worked with. Rolls-Royce engineers came to Detroit to train Packard workers in British manufacturing methods. American production standards had to be revised upward to meet the engine's demands. The first Packard-built Merlin was demonstrated at the East Grand Boulevard plant on August 2, 1941. Within months of Pearl Harbor, full production was underway. By the war's end, Packard would build 54,714 Merlin engines, nearly all of the American production of a British design, manufactured in Detroit by auto workers who'd converted their skills from building luxury cars to building the machines that would win the air war. George T. Christopher, who became Packard's president in 1942, understood that wartime production required more than just engineering. It required morale. Together with Kurt Murdoch, president of UAW Local 190, Christopher launched a program called Work to Win. The idea was simple: give workers visibility into how their production affected the war effort, and production would increase. The plant installed enormous scoreboards tracking output against quotas. Billboards displayed the faces of Packard workers who'd gone overseas. At the main entrance, a display showed which battlefronts were using Packard-built engines that week. The results surprised even the organizers. Production increased as much as 80% in some departments. Workers submitted more than 7,000 suggestions for improving efficiency. The antagonism that often defined labor management relations softened into something that felt, for those wartime years, like shared purpose. But the war years also exposed the fault lines that ran through the plant and the city. In June 1943, just months after the famous Detroit race riot that left 34 dead, white workers at Packard halted production to protest the promotion of black co-workers to the aircraft engine assembly line. The walkout lasted several days. More than 25,000 workers participated at its peak, a wildcat strike that management and union leadership scrambled to end. The company eventually suspended 30 of the most vocal strike agitators. Production resumed, but the message was clear. The plant that built engines for the arsenal of democracy was also a place where American racism lived and breathed and shut down the assembly line. Packard's leadership navigated this carefully, or tried to. They needed every worker they could get. Federal contracts demanded production quotas, but the integration that wartime necessity pushed forward was fragile, resisted, Incomplete. Black workers gained some ground during the war years. When the war ended, much of that ground would be lost. At its wartime peak, the Packard plant employed more than 36,000 workers. The complex hummed around the clock, 3 shifts keeping the Merlins flowing. The proving ground tested engines until they failed, cataloging every weakness. Quality control caught defects that would have been invisible in peacetime production. The work was hard, the hours long, and the purpose clear: build the engines that win the war. And they did. Packard Merlins powered American and British aircraft across every theater of the conflict. The company received the Army-Navy E Award for production excellence. George Christopher and Kurt Murdoch stood together at ceremonies celebrating what labor and management had accomplished. Standing at that summit, looking out over a plant running at capacity, engines shipping daily to airfields around the world, employment at an all-time high, quality standards exceeding anything the company had achieved before, standing there in 1944 or early 1945, you might have believed that Packard had never been stronger. You would have been wrong. The war ended. The contracts ended with it. Packard pivoted back to automobiles with the same precision engineering approach that had built the Merlins. The post-war models were beautiful machines, wide, chrome-trimmed, powerful in the way that American prosperity demanded. Buyers who'd saved wartime wages lined up to spend them. For a few years, the order books stayed full, but something had shifted in the marketplace, and Packard was slow to see it. The big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, had also spent the war years building for the military. They emerged from the conflict with expanded factories, refined production techniques, and capital reserves that dwarfed the independents. GM alone could outspend all its competitors combined on design, engineering, marketing, and dealer networks. Packard had survived for 40 years on quality and reputation. The cars cost more because they were worth more. Ask the man who owns one. But post-war America was changing. The middle class was expanding. Buyers wanted new cars, lots of new cars, and they wanted them at prices the big three could offer and Packard couldn't match. The company tried to adapt. In 1935, facing Depression-era sales collapses, Packard had introduced the 120, a mid-priced model that abandoned the luxury market in favor of volume. The 120 attracted 10,000 prepaid orders before the first one left the factory. It saved the company. It also diluted the brand. A Packard was no longer automatically something special. It was just another car, competing with Buicks and Chryslers in a market segment where the giants had every advantage. After the war, this tension only intensified. The luxury buyers who'd made Packard's reputation were now a smaller piece of a much larger pie. The middle market buyers whom Packard needed were being courted by corporations with resources Packard couldn't match. Employment at the East Grand Boulevard plant dropped from its wartime peak. Production schedules that had run around the clock contracted to single shifts. The buildings that Albert Kahn had designed for a certain level of activity, the light-filled floors, the open spans, now held fewer workers making fewer cars. The board of directors looked at the numbers. They looked at the competition. They looked at what it would take to compete with General Motors, the investment in new models, new factories, new advertising campaigns, and they saw a gap that couldn't be closed alone. By 1954, Packard's sales had fallen 53% from their post-war peak. The company was losing money. The factories that had built Merlins stood half empty, and the leadership that had guided Packard through 4 decades of independence began to ask a question that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. What if the only way to survive was to stop being Packard? The answer was about to arrive, dressed up as a merger and presented as salvation. The men making that decision believed they were saving what they loved. They were wrong. The numbers told a story that Packard's leadership didn't want to hear. In 1954, General Motors controlled 48% of the American automobile market. Ford held 31%. Chrysler claimed 15%. Together, the big three accounted for 94 cents of every dollar Americans spent on new cars. That left 6% for everyone else. Studebaker, Nash, Hudson, Kaiser, Willys, and Packard, the company that had once defined American luxury, now fighting for scraps at a table set by giants. The mathematics were brutal. General Motors sold more cars in a single month than Packard sold in a year. Ford's advertising budget exceeded Packard's total revenue. Chrysler could lose money on an entire product line and absorb the loss without flinching. The independents had no such cushion. Every model had to succeed. Every year had to turn a profit. One bad bet, and the whole enterprise could collapse. James J. Nance had become Packard's president in 1952, recruited from the appliance division of General Electric with a mandate to modernize the company. He was 50 years old, silver-haired, a salesman by temperament and a deal-maker by instinct. At GE, he'd built the Hotpoint brand into a household name. The Packard board believed he could do the same for their cars. Nance looked at Packard's position, the declining market share, the aging product line, the factories running below capacity, and saw a problem that couldn't be solved by building better cars. The cars were already excellent. The engineering was sound. The craftsmanship remained. What Packard lacked was scale. General Motors could spread the cost of designing a new model across millions of units. Packard spread the same costs across tens of thousands. When GM invested in a new assembly technique or a new manufacturing process, the per-unit cost disappeared into volume. When Packard made the same investment, every car carried the weight. GM's dealer network blanketed the country. Thousands of showrooms in every state, every city, every small town where someone might want to buy a car. Packard's network was thin and getting thinner. Dealers who'd once been proud to carry the brand were now asking whether there was a future worth investing in. The big three could afford to lose money on one model while making it up on others. They could weather a bad year, a recession, a shift in consumer taste. Packard had no margin for error. One stumble, and the creditors would start circling. Nance believed the only answer was consolidation. If the independents couldn't compete with GM individually, maybe they could compete together, merge the companies, combine the dealer networks, share the engineering costs, build a fourth force in the American automobile industry, not as large as the big three, but large enough to survive. The logic was clean on paper. It ignored almost everything that made Packard what it was. Across the state line in Indiana, Studebaker was having the same conversation. The South Bend automaker had been building vehicles since the Civil War. Wagons first, then carriages, then automobiles. The company had history, tradition, a loyal workforce, and a factory complex that had converted to war production just as Packard had. Like Packard, Studebaker had survived the Depression. Like Packard, Studebaker was now watching its market share evaporate. In the first quarter of 1954, both companies lost money. Packard's sales were down 53% from the year before. Studebaker's were down 55%. The bleeding was accelerating, and neither company had enough cash reserves to sustain it for long. Paul Hoffman and Harold S. Vance led Studebaker, Hoffman as chairman, Vance as president. They'd been talking to Nance for months, meeting in hotel rooms and private clubs, sketching out combinations on the backs of napkins. The conversations had a certain desperation to them, masked by the language of strategic vision. A complete automotive line, from the low-priced Studebaker to the prestigious Packard. Combined dealer networks totaling nearly 4,000 locations. Cost savings through shared manufacturing and engineering. What they didn't talk about, at least not publicly, was how different the two companies were. Studebaker built cheap cars for budget-conscious buyers, practical transportation, nothing fancy, priced to move. Packard built expensive cars for customers who valued quality above all else. The Packard name meant something: precision, craftsmanship. The promise embedded in "ask the man who owns one." Studebaker meant something else entirely: basic transportation, value for money, cars that got you where you were going without pretending to be more than they were. Merging the two was like merging a Swiss watchmaker with a company that made alarm clocks. The products served different purposes. The customers had different expectations. The brands occupied different mental spaces in the American imagination. None of this stopped the deal from going forward. The merger was announced in the summer of 1954. Studebaker-Packard Corporation, they called it. Nance would serve as president and chief executive of the combined entity. Hoffman and Vance would hold senior positions. The headquarters would remain in South Bend. a detail that stung Detroit workers who'd assumed the prestige brand would anchor the new company. The stock swap valued Packard shares at a ratio that some analysts thought shortchanged Packard shareholders. But by then, Packard shareholders didn't have many alternatives. The theory was consolidation. The reality was contamination. Within months of the merger closing, problems emerged that the deal makers hadn't anticipated or had chosen not to see. Studebaker's South Bend operations were even more troubled than the public financials suggested. Quality control had slipped. Worker morale was low. The factories needed investment that the combined company couldn't afford. Studebaker had been bleeding cash for years, and the merger didn't stop the bleeding. It just spread the wound across a larger body. And Packard's reputation, the asset that was supposed to anchor the high end of the new company's lineup, began to corrode. The 1955 and 1956 Packards were built in Detroit, on the East Grand Boulevard line, with the same attention to engineering that had always defined the brand. The workers were the same. The standards were the same. The cars themselves were as well made as any Packard had ever been. But dealers were now selling them alongside Studebakers. Marketing budgets were split between product lines. And buyers who'd always associated Packard with exclusivity began to wonder what it meant that the company had merged with a budget automaker. Ask the man who owns one had always implied something. Ownership was a mark of distinction. Now ownership meant sharing a showroom with the cheapest cars on the market. A buyer who walked into a Studebaker Packard dealership might see a gleaming Packard Caribbean, V8 engine, leather interior, every luxury the era could offer, parked next to a Studebaker Champion that cost a third as much. The juxtaposition was corrosive. If Packard was truly in the same league as Rolls-Royce, what was it doing keeping company with Studebaker? Nance tried to maintain the separation. Packard would remain the prestige brand. Studebaker would handle volume. The dealer networks would stay distinct where possible. But the corporate reality kept bleeding through. When newspapers wrote about the company, they wrote about Studebaker Packard. When analysts assessed the stock, they assessed Studebaker Packard. When suppliers negotiated contracts, they negotiated with Studebaker Packard. The hyphen became a chain, dragging Packard's name down to a level it had spent 50 years rising above. Inside the East Grand Boulevard plant, workers watched the merger unfold with a mixture of anxiety and resignation. They'd seen what happened to other independents, Nash and Hudson merging to form American Motors, Kaiser leaving the car business entirely, the slow consolidation that was thinning the industry year by year. The pattern was always the same: merger, then consolidation, then plant closings, then layoffs. The synergies that executives promised in press releases rarely materialized on the factory floor. Local 190 still represented them. The pension plan was still in place. Ben O. Miller was still collecting his monthly check, proof that the promises made during the good years could be kept. But the order books were thinning. The three-shift schedule had collapsed to two, then to one. Departments that had hummed with activity stood quiet. The light that poured through Albert Kahn's windows now illuminated workstations, where no one stood. The workers who remained, the skilled machinists, the tool makers, the assembly workers who'd spent their careers building the finest cars in America, did their jobs and waited. Some updated their resumes. Some talked to friends at Ford or GM about openings. Some refused to believe that a company that had survived 50 years, 2 world wars, and the Great Depression could disappear because of a merger that was supposed to save it. By late 1955, Studebaker Packard was hemorrhaging cash. The cost savings from the merger had failed to materialize. In fact, the combination had created new costs, new inefficiencies, new problems that neither company had faced alone. The sales declines had accelerated. The company's stock price had cratered to a fraction of its pre-merger value. Dealers were defecting to other brands. The bankers who'd financed the combination were getting nervous. And Nance, the deal maker who'd orchestrated the merger, was running out of deals to make. He'd bet his reputation on consolidation as the path to survival. The bet was failing. The company needed cash, more cash than the car business could generate, more cash than the banks would lend. One more deal remained. It would be the last. Roy T. Hurley ran Curtiss-Wright, an aerospace and defense company that had built aircraft engines during the war and now held military contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was not, by temperament or training, an automobile man. He'd spent his career in aviation, in defense contracting, in the world of government procurement and cost-plus contracts. He understood balance sheets and tax codes and the particular arithmetic of corporate acquisition. What he saw in the wreckage of Studebaker Packard was an opportunity. The arrangement announced in 1956 was called Operation Rescue. The name suggested salvation, a lifeline thrown to a drowning company by a stronger partner. The structure suggested something else. Curtiss Wright would provide $35 million in cash, enough to keep Studebaker Packard alive for another year, maybe two. In exchange, Curtiss Wright would take over management of the combined company. Hurley would become, in the words of one contemporary account, the real boss. The aerospace company would lease facilities from Studebaker Packard. Defense contracts, the military work that had kept the company afloat during the worst of the sales declines, would flow through Curtiss Wright's procurement channels. And the tax losses that Studebaker Packard had accumulated through years of red ink could offset Curtiss Wright's profits, reducing Hurley's tax burden by millions. It was, by any honest accounting, a deal that benefited Curtiss Wright far more than it benefited the automaker. But Studebaker Packard's leadership had no leverage. The alternative to Operation Rescue was bankruptcy. The alternative to Hurley's terms was liquidation. Nance and the board took what they could get. Harold E. Churchill, a Studebaker man who'd risen through the ranks in South Bend, would become chief executive of the automobile operations. He was a production specialist, an operations man, someone who understood how to run a factory efficiently. What he didn't have was a plan to sell more cars, and selling more cars was the only thing that could actually save the company. James Nance, who had bet his career on the merger strategy, stepped down from the top job. He stayed on as a consultant, a face-saving gesture that fooled no one. The dealmaker who'd promised consolidation would create a fourth force in the American automobile industry was now watching an aerospace executive call the shots. The transformation he'd envisioned had become something else entirely, a tax shelter dressed up as a rescue mission. The automobile business would be consolidated in South Bend. Studebaker production would continue. Cheaper cars, lower margins, whatever volume the market would bear. And the Detroit plant, the East Grand Boulevard complex where Albert Kahn had invented the modern factory, where Packard had built luxury cars for half a century, where 36,000 workers had assembled Merlin engines for the war effort, would be wound down. The announcement didn't use the word closed. Corporate communications rarely do. The language was softer. Production would be consolidated. Resources would be reallocated. The Detroit operations would be streamlined. Packard-branded vehicles might continue. Probably stop making Packards for a year, one executive told reporters, as if a year's pause were a minor inconvenience rather than a death sentence for a prestige brand that depended on continuity, on tradition, on the promise that the name meant something permanent. What this meant for the workers on East Grand Boulevard was simpler than the press releases suggested. The machines would stop. The shifts would end. The paychecks that had built houses in the neighborhoods around the plant, that had sent children to Catholic schools and state universities, that had funded retirements and paid off mortgages and kept the diners and bars and barber shops of the surrounding blocks in business, those paychecks would stop arriving. UAW Local 190 had represented Packard workers since the organizing drives of the 1930s. The local had negotiated contracts, fought for wages, established the pension plan that had made Benno Miller the first retiree to collect a monthly check. Kurt Murdoch, who'd stood beside George Christopher during the Work to Win campaign, was gone by then, but the local remained, its leadership scrambling to protect the workers who remained. But what could a union do when the company itself was dying? Local 190 could negotiate severance. It could fight for continuation of benefits. It could ensure that the contract's terms were honored during the wind down. What it couldn't do was keep the plant open. What it couldn't do was make Americans buy Packards. What it couldn't do was reverse the decisions that had led to this moment, decisions made in boardrooms by men who'd never punched a time clock or assembled a carburetor or known what it felt like to build something with your hands that other people would drive across the country. The Reuther Library, which holds the records of the UAW, describes what happened next in the flat language of institutional history. The Curtiss-Wright management agreement resulted in halting production and layoffs at the Detroit Packard plant. Behind that sentence were thousands of lives upended, toolmakers who'd spent 30 years mastering their craft, assembly workers who'd expected to follow their fathers onto the line and watch their sons follow them, families who'd bought houses within walking distance of the gates because the plant was permanent, because the work would always be there, because Packard had survived everything and would survive this too. Some of the older workers had already retired, men like Ben O. Miller, whose pensions were theoretically secure. But younger workers, men in their 30s and 40s who'd expected another 20 years on the line, suddenly found themselves looking for work in a city where the big three were also cutting back. Automation was replacing muscle. The factory jobs that had built the middle class were beginning their long disappearance, a disappearance that would hollow out Detroit and cities like it for the next half-century. Some workers found positions at Ford or GM, lateral moves that preserved their income but not their identity. They'd been Packard men. Now they were something else. Some left Detroit entirely, following rumors of work in California or Texas, or wherever the next opportunity might be. Some never worked in manufacturing again. The pension fund that had once been fully funded, that had paid Ben O. Miller's check month after month, proof that corporate promises could be kept, developed a deficit. The active workers whose contributions had sustained the fund were gone. The retirees who depended on it remained. The actuarial tables that had made the math work assumed a workforce that no longer existed, production that had stopped, a company that was dying by inches. Promises made during the good years became obligations that the dying company couldn't meet. Retirees who'd counted on those checks, who'd built their retirements around them, discovered that corporate promises had an expiration date. The final Packard automobile, built at the East Grand Boulevard plant, rolled off the line in 1956. There was no ceremony, no speech from management, no photographer capturing the moment for posterity. The workers who'd assembled it, who'd fitted the engine into the chassis, who'd hung the doors and adjusted the trim and checked the tolerances one last time, went home at the end of their shift. The next day, there was no shift to come back to. Some of the machinery was sold to other manufacturers, equipment that had been state-of-the-art when Packard installed it, now obsolete enough to be worth more as scrap than as productive capacity. Some was moved to South Bend, where Studebaker continued building cars with Packard nameplates for another 2 years. But those cars weren't really Packards. They were Studebakers with different badges. The Packard engineering legacy reduced to a marketing gimmick, a familiar name slapped onto an unfamiliar product in the hope that brand recognition might generate sales. It didn't. The customers who'd bought Packards for 50 years knew the difference. The last car to carry the Packard name was built in South Bend in 1958, a Studebaker in disguise, assembled by workers who'd never set foot in the East Grand Boulevard plant, who'd never known what it meant to build something that could rival Rolls-Royce. After that, nothing. The name disappeared from the American road, a brand that had defined luxury for 60 years, that had carried presidents and industrialists, that had promised quality so supreme you could ask anyone who owned one, that brands simply ceased to exist. The buildings remained, 3 million square feet of reinforced concrete and steel and glass, designed by Albert Kahn to last forever, engineered to hold the weight of heavy machinery and the vibration of production lines that never stopped. The structure was sound, the architecture was innovative, the windows still let in the daylight that Kahn had made his signature. What the buildings no longer held was purpose. For a few years, parts of the complex found tenants, small manufacturing operations that couldn't afford their own facilities, warehouses storing goods that would be shipped elsewhere. The kind of marginal uses that keep a building technically occupied without restoring anything like its former purpose. The rent was cheap. The landlords were desperate. Anyone willing to pay something for space that had been designed for everything was welcome to try. Local 190 tried to hold on. The union that had represented Packard workers since the Depression, that had negotiated the pension plan and the working conditions, and the wages that had built a middle-class life. The local closed its Detroit headquarters in 1958. The membership had collapsed along with employment. There was no one left to represent, no contracts left to negotiate, no grievances left to file. 7 years later, Local 190 was formally dissolved. The institution that had given workers a collective voice simply ceased to exist because the workers it represented no longer had jobs to organize around. The union hall that had hosted meetings and dances and retirement parties sat empty, then found other uses, then was forgotten. What remained was the building, and the silence inside it. The Packard plant became something its builders never intended, a symbol. Not a symbol of what American manufacturing could achieve, though it had been that once, when architecture students came from around the world to study Albert Kahn's innovations. Not a symbol of craftsmanship or quality, or the pride that came from building something worth building. The plant became a symbol of what happens when the work goes away. Through the 1960s, as Detroit's population began its long decline and the neighborhoods around East Grand Boulevard started to empty, the plant stood. The Big Three were consolidating too, closing older facilities, moving production to suburbs and exurbs, and eventually to other states, other countries. The workers who'd once lived within walking distance of the Packard gates found themselves commuting farther, or moving or leaving Detroit altogether. Through the 1970s, as the oil crisis rewrote the rules of the automobile industry and imports from Japan began their long march into the American market, the plant stood. The windows broke, weather, vandals, the slow entropy of structures that no one maintains. The roofs leaked. Rain pooled on the factory floors where workers had once assembled engines for the air war. Through the 1980s and 1990s, as Detroit's crisis deepened and the city became shorthand for urban decay, the plant stood. Scrappers stripped out anything valuable, copper wiring that could be sold by the pound, aluminum fixtures, the metal bones of machinery that had been left behind when the works stopped. What couldn't be sold was left to rust. Graffiti appeared on the walls, tags and murals and messages from people who'd found their way into the abandoned complex. Urban explorers documented the decay, posting photographs online that made the ruins famous in a way the factory itself had never been. The images spread, sunlight streaming through broken windows onto floors covered in debris, paint peeling from walls that had once displayed production quotas, trees growing through cracks in the concrete where roots had found purchase in the absence of maintenance. Ruin porn, critics called it, the aestheticization of decline, treating other people's catastrophe as visual entertainment for audiences who'd never worked a factory shift, never known what it meant to lose a job that was supposed to last forever. The plant became Detroit's most recognizable symbol of industrial collapse. Magazine articles about the city's troubles used it as a backdrop. Documentary filmmakers shot footage in its empty halls, the scale of the place, made for dramatic visuals. The decay providing ready-made atmosphere. Tourists came to see what abandonment looked like when it happened to 3 million square feet of reinforced concrete. One resident of the surrounding neighborhood, interviewed years later by Michigan Public Radio, put it simply, "We need someone to turn our nothing into something." The nothing lasted decades. Ownership of the property changed hands repeatedly, always at prices that reflected liability rather than value. The buildings required maintenance that no owner could afford. The environmental remediation required before redevelopment would cost millions. The sheer scale of the place, dozens of buildings connected by bridges and tunnels, spread across a site that had once employed a small city's worth of workers, made any redevelopment project daunting. In 2013, a Peruvian developer named Fernando Palazuelo purchased the complex for $405,000, less than the cost of a single house in many American neighborhoods, for more than 3 million square feet of industrial space. Palazuelo announced ambitious plans: mixed-use redevelopment, apartments, commercial space, a transformation of the ruin into something viable. Renderings showed the old Kahn buildings restored, new construction filling the gaps, life returning to East Grand Boulevard. The plans never materialized. The financing never came together. The building continued to decay. In 2019, part of the East Grand Boulevard Bridge, the span that had once carried the Packard name over the street, connecting sections of the complex, a physical manifestation of the brand that had built it, collapsed. No one was injured. The bridge had been closed for years, the danger obvious to anyone who looked. The collapse simply confirmed what everyone already knew. The structure was failing, piece by piece, year by year, in the same slow motion that had characterized everything else about the plant's long afterlife. 3 years later, Wayne County Circuit Judge Brian Sullivan ordered the property demolished as a public nuisance. The legal designation formalized what had been obvious for decades: the building that Albert Kahn had designed to last forever, that had pioneered the reinforced concrete construction system that would transform industrial architecture worldwide, had become a danger to everyone around it. The city of Detroit began phased demolition in 2022. The wrecking crews arrived with equipment that would have been unimaginable to the workers who'd built Merlins in those halls. Machines designed to tear down, in weeks, what had taken years to construct. By the end of 2024, most of the complex was gone. 3 million square feet of industrial architecture reduced to rubble, trucked away, erased from the landscape it had dominated for more than a century. Not all of it. The city designated one section, a portion of the original Kahn buildings, the earliest structures on the site, for preservation. A legacy structure, they called it, to be incorporated into whatever came next. What comes next has a name: Packard Park. Mayor Mike Dugan stood at a press conference in December 2025 and announced the vision for the site: a new industrial building, nearly 400,000 square feet of modern manufacturing space, designed for the kind of advanced manufacturing that might actually employ people in the 21st century. The preserved Kahn structure, renovated for housing and cultural uses, apartments, maybe artist studios, some acknowledgement of what the site had been. A development that would bring jobs back to the land where jobs had once defined a community. The developers, Mark Bennett and Orrin Goldenberg, promised completion by 2029. They talked about investment and opportunity and the transformation of blight into economic activity. They used the language the developers always use when they're asking a city to believe in them. The project would create manufacturing positions, not 36,000 of them, not even close. The new industrial building might employ a few hundred workers, maybe more if the tenants succeeded. A fraction of what the plant had held at its peak, but something. Work returning to a place that had known only absence for 60 years. Whether it happens remains to be seen. Detroit has heard promises before. Developers have announced plans for the Packard site before. The gap between rendering and reality is wide, and the history of urban redevelopment is littered with projects that never broke ground, financing that never closed, visions that remained. Visions. But the story of the Packard plant was never really about the building. It was about what the building held: the work, the workers. The particular rhythm of a life, organized around making something with your hands, arriving at the same gate your father arrived at, punching the same clock, building the same product to the same standard, knowing that the check at the end of the week was earned and the pension at the end of the career was promised. James Ward Packard built his first car because someone told him he couldn't. Henry Bourne Joy saw something worth investing in and gathered the money to make it real. Albert Kahn designed a factory that changed how factories were designed. Benno Miller spent 30 years as a toolmaker and collected the first pension check the company ever issued. George Christopher and Kurt Murdoch stood together during a war and proved that labor and management could build something neither could build alone. All of them are gone now. The brothers from Warren, the Detroit investors, the architect and the toolmaker, and the president and the union leader. The 36,000 workers who filled the plant at its peak. The men who made the decisions that unmade the company. The plant outlived them all, then outlived its own purpose by more than half a century. 60 years of silence in a structure designed for noise. 60 years of emptiness in a place built for work. 60 years of waiting for someone to turn the nothing into something. The building is mostly gone now. The rubble has been cleared. The land sits ready, waiting for whatever comes next. But if you'd stood at the corner of East Grand Boulevard on a morning in 1944, stood there as the shifts changed, and the workers streamed through the gates, as the Merlin engines tested on the proving grounds and the windows caught the first light of dawn, you'd have seen something that felt permanent, something that felt like it would last. Ask the man who owns one, they used to say. The answer was always the same. This is what quality looks like. This is what pride feels like. This is what work can build when it's done right. The slogan is gone now, like the cars it sold and the company that made them, and the plant where the making happened. What remains is the question, still hanging in the air over that empty lot on East Grand Boulevard, still waiting for an answer that might never come. What happens to a place when the work goes away? Detroit is still figuring that out. So is the rest of America. The Packard plant, in its silence, offered one answer. Nothing good. Nothing quick. Nothing easy. Just decades of waiting. And then the wrecking ball. And then maybe something new rising from the ground where the old thing fell. The workers who built Merlin's there are mostly gone now. The retirees who collected those first pension checks have passed. The children who grew up in the shadow of the plant have children and grandchildren of their own, living lives that have nothing to do with making cars. But somewhere in a drawer, in a house on a street that used to fill with Packards on payday, there might still be a photograph, a toolmaker accepting a check, a union president standing beside him, company officials in suits watching the moment become official. A promise made in an era when promises like that seemed like they'd last. They didn't. Nothing does. What remains is the memory of what it felt like when they did.